Yes.
Good?
Let's try it again.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Good.
Sounds good.
All right. So I was trying not to get stuck behind this podium, but I think I am stuck behind the podium. Something that I realized in listening to all of your talks, very wonderful talks, mine is a little bit more theoretical. I think we're coming, a lot of Jorge's work is actually theoretical. Sam's, who you'll hear later, a little more on the theoretical side. So I either apologize for that or
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
give you the gift of such thing. Evolution and the poetics of indigenous participation. So this talk comes out of a class, well, in some ways it comes out of a class that I'm going to co-teach next spring with a mentor of mine, Maldoma Some at CIS. And so part of the class is, part of my inspiration and curiosity has been around evolution. And then part of my challenge in some ways has been my relationship with different indigenous people who consider themselves indigenous. So how can I work with an evolutionary theory and at the same time honor someone like Maldoma Some or someone who doesn't so neatly fit on one of those nice maps that folks have made. So this is what I've been working towards for a long time. A lot of what you'll see in the talk, you'll notice sort of Jorge's hand there, as I've worked with him for a long time too. And I will ask someone, who are you timing? Someone, yeah? Just give me a sense of 20 minutes so I can kind of start and do some questions too. So, a lot of my work is born out of a tension. And the tension is my attraction to an evolutionary theory and also my ongoing relationships with people like Maldoma Some. So what Some is doing is he's actually laughing at me. He has a lot of good-natured fun in my tendency to ask, is there something called reality? Is there something real? What's this whole thing about evolution? He thinks there's a great humor to him in that, and he thinks that somewhere in there is the seed to the Western problem. Like, we have this problem. The Africans are all looking at us and they're saying, well, that's your problem. And he doesn't think much more about it. So that's kind of his thing, and we have this ongoing conversation. But then on the other side, there's this other guy. And so you wonder, is he laughing? And I'm not so sure that he's laughing with some of the things that I have written or am writing. But this was in some ways my first introduction to an evolutionary theory of consciousness. And so there is an attraction. There's a reason why that he's become as popular as he has. And so when I first started my studies at CIS many years ago, I was attracted to him and also repulsed by him, right? And so a lot of the work has come out of that. And what I've come to understand is that he's working with, and I'll explain these later, but a hierarchy of division and or a hierarchy of dualism. Whereas what Maldoma is working with is a hierarchy of relationship. And there are different ways of knowing and different ways of being, but they're both hierarchical. Maldoma actually, the Dagra, who Maldoma is an elder in that community, have an evolutionary theory of consciousness. It's really clear, it's laid out, really well articulated. And so part of my own question too, and part of the question I bring to this talk is how is that similar to what I'm doing? How is that similar to what maybe someone like Jorge is doing? How is it different? And also the question of complicating things. How is it different what the Africans are doing, especially the West Africans, the Dagra, versus what Native American or American Indian is doing? Because there's actually real differences. And so it's also complicating the idea that there's this thing called indigenous, and that's them, they're indigenous, and we're not, we're over here, we're something not indigenous, unfortunately. And a lot of what I have done is play with philosophy. And so why philosophy? Especially in relationship to the Africans and to the American Indians. It's a place where they have a critical self-understanding, where they're working with this word, indigenous, and they complicate the word. It's not so easy. You can't just go around saying, you're indigenous, you're not. What is indigenous? If I were to use the word as someone who maybe didn't grow up identifying as such, or growing up as someone who was identified as such, to define that word in that sort of isolation is very different than going into a conversation with a bunch of people who've thought a lot about this. And they've thought a lot about the word. And so part of my work is, like it says there, to think with rather than about. And I tend towards the African, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. But in particular in the philosophy, there was a book published in 2003. It was called American Indian Thought, Philosophical Essays, At that point, those were all the people in that book were all the people of Native American descent who have ever had a PhD in philosophy. In 2003, you could put them all in a little bitty book. That's not true of Africa. Africa's it goes on for a couple hundred years, a little bit more than that. It's very complicated. There's a lot of information there. Anything that I and my great big ideas had thought, they've already thought it through. It's incredible the amount of information that's there. And so this gives me someone to be in relationship with and to be in communication with. It is also, I think, important for transpersonal studies. I was sharing at lunch about this, about when we're talking about trying to bring in the balance that Jorge was talking about earlier. The mind in a place like ITP or a place like CIS sometimes gets a bad rap. And so philosophy is a great word because it kind of triggers that. So philosophy for me is a really important word to sort of recover and to bring back into our conversations around psychology, religion, and break down those seemingly strong barriers between those kinds of things. So that's why philosophy. And then it's to begin to break down the point of my conversation in some ways. A lot of what I think I'm doing is a critique of modernity, which I'll share as we go along. But what modernity, I think, likes to do is make really simple things. They like to make stuff like Western equals linear, indigenous equals circular, and then you go hang out. And actually, the American Indians generally are okay with that. They're very proud of that. Yes, we have this circular logic, you have that linear logic, it's different, this is why maybe we're better than you are, this is why maybe we should talk to each other, it depends on who you talk to. You guys should leave us alone, that stuff's bad for you. So there's a lot of reactions. Whereas in Africa, it's not nearly as simple. You have people who have thought through all sorts of things, and there's linear logic and circular logic, and there's every kind of logic you could possibly imagine, and everyone's back and forth. And there's this big long history of interacting. So that, again, is why partially the interest in Africa. And then modernity and colonialism, I think, are really built on these oversimplifications. So what I've done, I'm looking for some way to cope with an evolutionary theory. I want an evolutionary theory that works and that invites communication between different kinds of people. Who knows why? I'm stuck on that. But I continually come back to it as much as I try to get away from it. And so the participatory approach, which partially Jorge was talking about earlier today, brings in Jorge's thing, and emancipatory epistemology, which he touched upon through his talk. And there's also John Heron, which was also talked about an extended epistemology. But just basically saying that there's different ways of knowing. And so for the purposes of this talk, and to keep it really simple, just focusing on the intra part of, so intrapersonal ways of knowing, and saying that there's a body, a vital self, a heart, a mind. These are different ways of knowing, and that they're all interacting somehow. And that a philosophy or a psychology or religion somehow would be emboldened or made better if all these different things could be invited into the conversation. So I can't help but add my own word. So I've added traditional and or practical, vital, relational, reflective. For whatever reason, those words kind of speak to me. So is your philosophy, is your psychology, is it reflective? Is it relational? Is it vital? Is it alive? And now you can start to see and compare different things. So when it's really healthy, if it's traditional, it can be very practical, it can work, right? If it's vital, it can enliven you and it can excite you, it can feel like magic, it feels like you're in the flow. If it's engaged, it's very phenomenological. You know, it's this process of going deeply into the story and just really unfolding this rich thing. If it's reflective and it's healthy, it can be enlightening. It can show you all sorts of things that you may not have seen before. There's a certain kind of awareness that comes from it. Probably because of working with Jorge, sometimes the sexuality gets emphasized. So I'll use that particular example, unhealthy emphasis. So when tradition is unhealthy, I use the example of abstinence only. It's not very practical. You know, it just sort of cuts it out. We're just not going to talk about it. Abstain, don't do it. Vitality, when it's not healthy, you start creating love potions. You try to make something happen. The spark is not there, so you go pay someone down the street to, you know, boil up something, or you buy them dinner, or you do something to create a love potion, make them fall in love with you. Relational, when it's not healthy, potentially could turn towards romance novels. You get absorbed into these things. It's not really engaged. It's an abstraction from a relationship. You get lost in these sort of ongoing sagas of, you know, kind of a soap opera type thing. And I kind of see romance novels as sort of a heart version of pornography. So pornography is more of that reflective. It's sort of, you've abstracted so far away, you're just sort of fantasizing about sexuality. And that's not terribly enlightening. It's just sort of lost. In the same way that a romance novel maybe is not terribly engaged, it's kind of lost. So in this way, you have a lens where you can start to walk in and be in communication with someone and not say, you know, you're more primitive, or I'm more this or more that. You have just a little bit bigger, broader language and lens to be in conversation with people. And so in my own work, really bringing in, not the idea, what was mentioned, bracketing, rather than bracketing, really sort of embracing who I am. So if I'm going to be a philosopher, if I'm going to be a psychologist, whatever it is that I'm supposed to be, I'm all these things. The book that you see up there, Coming to the Edge of the Circle, for those that are interested, is it's a Wiccan initiation, is what the woman is talking about, but it is an incredible defense of the scholar practitioner. So for those people who are bringing that piece into your work and you want to talk about your own experience, that's one of, I think, the better books. The first chapter is one of the better things that's been written. So she's talking about herself as a Wiccan, which sort of emboldens me to talk about myself as the vital part of myself, the diviner, the Western esoteric tradition that I come from, the dog or a shell divination that I practice. These things are important. If I'm going to be a philosopher, then maybe I should be a diviner. Maybe this vitality, maybe I should pay attention to something like divination, something that wouldn't be accepted in most academic studies of philosophy. And then the idea of rites of passage, the elder in training, the relational piece, like that's absolutely necessary if I'm going to be a philosopher and not be abstracted somehow. So if I'm able to engage, it's very important that we be able to look at each other and see how we're showing up in community. How am I showing up as a father? How am I showing up as a husband? And in particular for myself, where I've actually committed to a particular people, the Dagara, and said, I will take on your story. Like I'll take on responsibility within your community and carry that where we both agreed, and said it out loud and everybody knows it. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to say that I'm going to be somehow responsible for my community? And then how does that relate to my theories, my grand ideas about what might be? And then there's a reflective, sage piece, the contemplative practices that we all so love or hate. A lot of early transpersonal psychology paying attention to these meditative practices, just a whole host of practices that in some ways became the great world traditions, right? Some of the other things were sort of relegated to the sides, marginalized somehow, and these reflective, contemplative practices came to the forefront. And so not wanting to do away with those, but bring them back in. And then really making a case that if you are a scholar, you have to be a practitioner. That if you're a scholar, you have to bring in all the aspects of your lived experience. And that's what I'm seeing as the new practical, the new tradition. The new tradition is the ability to be in communication, to be in participation with all the different parts of yourself and with all the, So when Jorge's talking, saying that the intrapersonal, so all the parts of yourself, which is a little bit more what I'm focusing on here, but also the interpersonal, just about anybody else you could possibly imagine, and the transpersonal, so something larger than all of that, or smaller than all of that. So it's really being in community somehow. And what I'm trying to also show is that a lot of what happens in academia is a kind of modern reflective participation that is really a non-participation, which I'll unpack a little bit. So if you see something that looks like dualism, it's probably modernity and or postmodernity or some side of that coin. So just one way of sort of pointing out, Scott Pratt, who teaches at the University of Oregon, one of his first book was one of his first books, Native Pragmatism, was a great text, kind of American Indian, Native American philosophy, let's say. But his most recent book, Logic, where he draws a really clear line between discernment and dualism. So it's fine to discern, it's fine to divide, it's maybe not okay to cut. And so modernity and postmodernity, I would say, often tends to cut. It's either or, it oversimplifies, there are lots of ways that it does it, but that's not to say that somehow the mind is bad or philosophy is not good. And so I differentiate, I'll come back to these. So I'm trying to differentiate between classic reflective, so classic sort of mental focused participation, and modern participation. So there's something that's very that people were doing, and it was very healthy. The traditions of the book, Sanskrit, Greek, Arabic, they were all there's some sort of truth or salvatory experience, liberation. There's something that they're all looking for, and it's a healthy thing. And there are hierarchies involved, and that's totally fine. They're looking for some sort of continuity. They've noticed that there's change, trying to stand on some sort of solid ground or get rid of the ground. Whatever it is, it's a particular kind of movement, it's a particular kind of knowing. And it tends to marginalize or sublimate with the Tantra vital and relational participations. So in some ways, what I'm suggesting in the evolution, that there are times when people really focused on this to potentially the detriment or just all out ignored some other ways of knowing. And so some other ways of knowing that are really important, divination, which is my example because that's what I'm most familiar with, but magic, synchronicity, words that maybe are not allowed in academia, magic. There's some great books about how magic and witch and cannibal, which actually I focus on in my dissertation, how there's these words that are used to really strongly other something. And so if it's really bad, it's like a cannibal or a terrorist, or that's our thing today, magic. But there is a hierarchy of power. There is some way of, a diviner is doing something. There's a logic to it. infinite numbers of ways that people engage with these practices. But in this, there is no directionality. There's nothing but change. There's no order. You're just sort of following the flow. I mean, this is really in some ways about the flow. And there's creativity and novelty are encouraged, but there's really no evolution. And then elderhood and relational participation are really hierarchies of relationship. So this is when you get into, for example, the Omatakuasan, the Native American saying of like all my relations. There's a tendency within that to say the people, everything's the people. And so what you do, it's kind of a circular kind of logic that includes. It's really good about including, but in some ways it doesn't allow totally for difference. So anything that comes up that's novel comes into the story, it becomes part of the people, all my relations. And so there's no evolution here. There's nothing new. So when Malidoma is laughing at me, it's fine to an extent, but it's not really my reality. In my reality, I'm actually concerned about novelty. I'm concerned about a kind of creativity. I'm concerned about being in communication with people who maybe think there's a directionality, or people that think something different than what. So, it's not necessarily, there's two things. One is, does Malidoma need to get on board with me? Not at all. He's totally fine where he's at, but I'm not. Like, I'm trying to be in conversation with more people, whereas he's doing his thing and for the good, but he's very much focused on one very particular way of knowing, or a couple ways of knowing, really. And so what's sought here is communal stability. So change is, it's a little tricky, and you want to just kind of bring it in, somehow contextualize it. And so, the new practical. What is a scholar practitioner? What are we up to as scholars coming from out of ITP, CIS? There's a sense of coming back to the complexity of lived experience. The point being that we're talking phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, these really amazing people who I'm fascinated by. And it's not that everyone else has to be fascinated by them. There's a lot of different ways: feminism, pragmatism, somatic, integral, transpersonal, and/or psychology. There's all these different ways in which people are saying, hey, wait, you're all stuck in your heads. You're doing that whole modern thing where you're oversimplifying, making dualisms, big chasms. We don't want to do that. And so what has been really fascinating for me in my studies has been finding all of these mathematicians who said there's a limit to that. And actually real good logic goes back to the enormity of our lived experience. So I've found them very fascinating, and hence the whole piece around philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead, for me in particular, has been important, but there's all of these people, and there's many others if you were to follow that particular path. And so our planetary predicament, and this is the point, what all of those people would say in some ways is that you can't come up with a new theory. We're not looking for the next big theory. It won't work. So what is it? What is it? Why philosophy? Why practice? Why psychology? Why are we in this sort of search? And part of the reason that I think is because we have to communicate with each other. We're sort of stuck in the situation. You may like it, you may not, but we have to talk to each other. And so it's not the new theory, it's actually the new participation is what we're up to, and we have to figure out ways to do that. And so for me, this is me trying to come in and say maybe evolution has something to offer us, maybe philosophy has something to offer us, maybe these particular people have something to offer us. But it's going in and knowing that we have to talk to each other. And so what I've often struggled with, or basically there's sort of a circular relational way of knowing, which I find a lot of the times when I hang out, sometimes with Malidoma, sometimes not. A lot of the times though with Native American tradition, where they're saying, you're going the wrong way. What are you doing? This is crazy. you're killing us. You people are messing up. And I'm thinking that there has to be more to the story than that, right? It's not just like you're right, we're wrong. So something's going on. And so how does this framework, this lens, help me to start to discern out and say, no, you definitely have something to offer. You have this kind of relational piece, this rites of passage that we need. But there's more. And so the classic modern reflective piece, you all are primitive. We somehow contain you. That was the struggle with the Wilbur piece. Somehow he's supposed to contain, he transcended and included Malidoma. That's really odd. Like, I mean, having met both of these people, it doesn't quite add up. And so there's something wrong with just a straight linear way of seeing the world. There's a relational piece that's missing. So you need to get the Native American, the Dogara, the Wilbur, all in some room and find some way for them to be in conversation with each other. And so the new logic has to be practical, reflective, relational, and vital. And the words right before, those are all Whitehead's words. So in some ways I'm a piece that I won't talk about at all here because it's kind of complicated things and probably not so interesting. But I'm taking Whitehead and I'm teasing out this whole lens through his philosophy, basically, his logic. So, little takeaways: overemphasis, marginalization. Wilbur 4 and 5, for those that are more into that whole world. There's a real problem of linear historical accounts of evolution, and that's the first thing that sort of hit me when I got into contact with his work. Malidoma laughing at me, there's a problem with that. There's a circular kind of all my relations account of evolution. It doesn't quite satisfy the whole story. And then the piece that maybe in some ways is even more interesting for me is the piece around modernity and how it tends to oversimplify, and how that was really the power of this sort of colonial power that went out was a way of othering other people and saying somehow we're different than you. And so, indigenous equals this, Western equals this, feminine is that, masculine is this. It's all these really easy categories that don't really hold water once you get into them. And so starting to tease those out and see that that's a dualistic way of using the mind, but that's not the healthiest way. That you actually can do hierarchies, you actually can do categories, you actually can do a lot of cool things with your mind, but you have to be careful not to go too far, because it needs to be somehow embodied in the way that Jorge was talking about earlier, about this sort of passionate humility. So, this is sort of I have some other more particular things comparing the Dogara and Native American traditions and how they're different, because I think it's important to tease those out. But I won't necessarily go into those. I want to go into questions. But this is really what I've come to as a participatory approach to evolution, where you include novelty, you thrive off novelty. There's some sort of order amidst the novelty, and you establish limits to it. And so that's kind of what's carried me through, and why evolution is important, because it's such a crucial piece of that theory to somehow account for novelty. So, kind of the end for now, and we'll just kind of, if there are questions, I'll take the.
How does language fit in?
Language is it's a lot. It can be tricky. No. It's great, because like there's this whole thing around ethno-philosophy. Like the African tradition is great around this, because is philosophy, like, can you translate? Like is it possible is there really a thing that's Yoruba philosophy and Dogara philosophy and Bantu philosophy? Can you take them out of those languages? What is language? Is there really a difference between books and oral histories? And so there's a lot of really good material that's been written on it, and it's really tricky. And so I think I touch on it at times, but I haven't quite figured out how to quite get in there. And one of the things I found most recently, there's a lot of work done on a particular group of Aboriginals from Australia where their language is so different, it's something so radically different, that it then throws a wrench in everyone else's theories. They actually have no sense of right, left. They don't.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's absolute space. So west, east, north, south. There's no sense of self. There's absolutely no self. What does that mean? Do they have a self? So those are awesome questions. Those are really amazing questions. And people have done it, and some people haven't done it very well. So it gets really tricky. So there's a couple minutes. So I think we'll call it a day.
I just want to say that I don't know. I feel it very brave of you what you're doing, and kind of noble, and I don't know, even like you know, like the cutting edge, like to stand before Native American spiritual communities, you know, and be able to kind of critically honor, you know, their position and the pain and the marginalization and the genocide, you know, that has been wrought upon them, and at the same time say, well, there's a relationship that's here, and where am I in it, and how am I being honored, how am I being felt in this relationship? Because it can be so easy to go to a place of guilt or go to a judgmental place of, you know, all the colonization that your history has brought you. So I don't know if you want to speak to how you've come to that edge and how it's been for you voicing that. Just
so there's a lot there for sure, and it's been it's a long journey. I mean, all these things, the thing around indigenous, and one of the early words that found me was shaman. So what is this whole thing around shamanism? And this crazy word follows you around, and it's been a long journey of like trying to come to terms with those things. And one of the things that I have come to, I find it interesting. So there's somehow maybe a hint of maybe there's something indigenous in this talk, and people are excited. People want to go to that talk, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something that we've done where we've actually made them, whoever they are, because they're not different than us, whoever they are. It's just a bunch of humans hanging out, and some of them, you know, because the thing you get from Africa is that there's actually this really kind of pronounced individuality, but they're not supposed to have that. They're supposed to only have this circular logic thing. But wait, it gets like if you actually talk to people, it gets really confusing, and it's not so straightforward. And so I think part of what my process has been is to actually come to stand within myself and really honor that. And so having done that, and not having othered someone else, like I haven't made them noble, whoever they are. I haven't made them, the host of things that we do, to somehow say that someone has it and we don't. Because I think that's where this huge line, modernity draws this huge line and says, you're on that side, I'm on this side. And so I think it's a practice of like how to get across that. And my journey has really been like kind of seeing through it to some extent, and noticing that I'm kind of like this and you're kind of like that too. And there's not a huge difference. And so we've all in some ways suffered certain things. And the thing that I think that gets reflected back to me is that whatever it is inside of me, I can actually then go into difficult conversations, and maybe someone could feel heard on the other side that hasn't been heard somewhere else. And so that's just an ongoing process of being invited into communities and people saying, oh, well, I don't quite get what's going on, but something's going on, and it feels good. And so we can hang out. Why not? So that's kind of but I think we're done. So.